once again. Welcome everybody to the key insights and actual tactics from the IBM email and mobile metrics benchmark report webinar. It's being brought to you today from LSC Digital, but also IBM and the Watson marketing team. So I'm just going to take a couple seconds to go through the agenda today that we're going through, and also introduce you to myself and my presenter from the Watson marketing team today. Now, everybody who attends this webinar today will receive a recording, and we will also shoot out the slides and of this presentation along with the benchmark report. So if you miss anything, don't worry about it. And also, too, I want to encourage everybody that's attending, you should see in the right-hand bottom corner a chat box. So during the presentation, if you have some questions, please feel free to put them in there real quick. We will leave some time at the end of the webinar today to go through some of those questions. And if time doesn't allow to answer all those questions, we'll get back to everybody that we weren't able to get to. So without further ado, let's get going. So for today, our agenda. So we'll take a little bit of time talking about the best ways in using benchmark data to take your marketing program to another level. And we'll actually take a look at some of the specifics of that data and then talk about tactics to improve those open rates. And like I said, we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end of this presentation. And I can't encourage people enough to use that chat box in the bottom right-hand corner to answer your questions. So who's presenting today? First off, let me introduce myself. My name is Dave Clement. I'm the VP of Digital Operations here at LSC Digital. Just a little background about myself. I've been in the online marketing space for about 20 years, started in the late 90s, and have been very lucky to work with all shapes and sizes of organizations, and from anything helping them with search engine optimization to paid advertising. And I've been highly focused on email marketing really the past 15 years and had some great opportunities. My previous role was working at Dun & Bradstreet, helping with both their digital products and their digital marketing efforts. And I would also like to introduce today my co-presenter, Lauren McDonald. Lauren?
Hey, everyone. Hey, thanks, everyone, for joining, and thanks, Dave, for the opportunity to present with you. And yeah, just a quick background on myself. Like Dave, I've been in really the digital and email space for nearly 20 years, since kind of the late 90s, but similar to Dave, really focused on email marketing beginning about 2001, and have worked with a number of vendors in the space, formerly Silverpop, before that Email Labs and Lyris, and actually started doing benchmark studies back in the day at Email Labs. I did sort of the first one in this industry about 2004. So been doing email marketing benchmark studies for a long time, and this is now, I think, between the combination of Silverpop and IBM, which acquired Silverpop in 2014. I think this is my sort of ninth one or something like that at the combination of Silverpop and IBM. So excited to share some stats and work with Dave on sharing some tips and best practices.
That's great. So let's get going. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to start talking about benchmark data.
All right, so when you think about benchmarking, fundamentally benchmark data can help answer a couple of questions. So go ahead and click to the next one. Is like, are we average? Or go ahead and click, are we a top performer, right? Fundamentally, and you go ahead and click to the next one, but fundamentally, when we think about benchmark data, a lot of people use it to think about, basically, how do we stack up, sort of against ourselves and against, sort of the industry and competitors and stuff like that. But really what sort of the focus of today that Dave and I are going to really talk about is, beyond that. So fundamentally, benchmarks are most valuable when you, go ahead and click, use them to take your marketing program to another level. Now, if you look up in the top there of the Marshall stack AMP, you see I put in a little 11 there. Now, when I present this, when I talk about sort of benchmark reports at a live audience, I always use a little humorous Spinal Tap video to sort of get it across. Take it to 11. So that's my really poor British rock star accent, but it always gets a good laugh. But unfortunately, video doesn't play very well in the webinar, so we'll just have to go with my really bad rendition there. So go ahead and take it off to the next one. So what I'm going to talk about next for the next sort of couple of minutes is the study itself and give you sort of some insight to it. So as I mentioned, we've been doing the benchmark report. Really, I launched it at SilverPop back in 2009. We've been doing it pretty much every year since then. And so one of the things that I do, basically, this is data that comes from, we basically work with engineers, we write scripts to pull the data across the IBM Watson marketing campaign automation client base. So this is data just from our clients. One of the things that I always get requests for is to sort of slice it up smaller and smaller. And so this past year, and so this data is from our client base from 2017. One of the things that I was able to do this year is add 2 new regions. So you can see there we now have 9 regions. So if you have operations, I assume most everybody on this call is in the US, but if you have divisions and things like that in other parts of the world, you can look at the data and compare against those regions. So this past year we added India and Latin and South America and the Caribbean. So if you have divisions, offices, let's say in Chile or Mexico or something like that, or work with groups in India and stuff like that, we have those sort of new ones. And so across that's 40 countries in total that we're pulling from. So go ahead and click. Okay. The other thing that we do, and this is fundamentally the thing that I get sort of the most requests on, is around industries. Everybody wants to benchmark literally against a mirror of their own company, which is sort of pretty difficult. I always sort of use this humorous example of where people email me and say, we're a bank in Romania. Can you benchmark against banks in Romania? And no, I can't, right? Because we don't have enough clients that are banks in Romania. But as I mentioned, every year I try to get narrower and narrower on industries and regions and stuff. We've been pretty consistent at the 20 industries over the last several years. And if you've used the report before, I changed kind of some of the definitions and categorizations of a couple of them, so make sure you just check and look at that. But you can see, we get as about as narrow as we can with keeping sort of the data really at a high confidence level that I have, enough companies in there to make the data reliable. So go ahead and click on the next one.
Well, 1 second. There we go.
Right, and the other thing that I'm really sort of most proud of, there obviously, I think I looked a while back, there's probably 10 or 12 other email marketing benchmark reports that are done by other vendors and other companies in the space. But one of the things that I'm most proud of, beyond sort of the level of being able to slice by those geographic regions and the industries, is something that pretty much, as far as I know, nobody else does, which is slice the data more than just by average, right? And so if you didn't take statistics in college or whatever, mean is the correct term for average, right? Which is the mathematical average. You add everything up and divide by the number of inputs, if you will, into that, and you get an average. Median is something that, as far as I know, nobody else does as well, which basically looks like, if you think of a highway median, all the data that's on the left side of that median and the right side of the median. So it's as you can see just from this example, and you'll see it as we go through, some of the mean and median averages, quote unquote, if you will, can often be pretty significantly different. Just on this slide, you can see, there's half a dozen percentage points difference often between the mathematical average and the median. And so one of the reasons I provide both is just so you can use the ones that help you the most in making your case, whether that means looking good or if you're falling short, showing sort of how much more resources and things you need, stuff like that. But the most important thing that I'm going to get across on this slide is really the top quartile. Writer I worked with years ago came up with this tagline that I've been using for years: average is the new bottom, right? The idea being that who wants to add, and we'll ask that question when I present this to a live audience.
All right, it sounds like we're having some problems with sounds on Lauren's end. So with that being said, I can pick it up from here real quick. Going off of what Lauren's point was, your audio connection has been lost. We just lost sound. Okay. Hello, folks. Can you hear us now? Are we back on?
Oh. Dave, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. We had a little bit of a technical issue that's never happened before. So we're back on. Lauren, what you were talking about, which I think is really important, is talking about average is the new bottom. And I think you're going to say something, and I couldn't agree more, is what I ran into all the time, especially being a consultant. Benchmark reports are awesome to see where everybody's at and how you should be measuring yourself. But I've always said to people, even if you're above average, above the mean, it's not about being average. It's about, well, how do you go improve that 10%? How do you improve that 15%? You're always aiming to do better. So just turning it back over to you.
Okay, yeah. So really, again, you kind of, made my point there, is that what I want you to think about is when you get the report and we go through this is, benchmarking yourself against the average is great, but what you really want to shoot for, do you not, is sort of the top quartile. And then we also provide the bottom quartile, but that's really just, hopefully you're not down in that category, but if you are, it gives you a sense of how far you need to go. So go ahead and click to the next slide.
Great. And then going on to the next slide, now what we'll start talking about a little bit is the stats and the tactics, the real meat of why everybody came, right, Lauren?
Yep, exactly.
All right.
So what we're going to do sort of from this point on is I'm going to kind of set Dave up with walking through just kind of quickly some of the stats, and then sort of the real key is Dave's going to sort of walk through sort of tips and best practices, kind of how to actually improve your performance and rates. So starting off with this first one, with sort of looking at the unique open rate by geo and region. So again, those are those 9 regions. A couple of quick things is you can see that the performance is sort of all over the map or around the sort of the different regions in the world, but 2 sort of countries/regions stand out above everybody else. That's Canada and Australia, and then sort of some of the more emerging markets, if you will, Asia Pacific and India kind of are at the bottom, with sort of US and Europe and stuff kind of in between there. And I'm not going to spend much time on this because we've got a lot to get to, but one of the sort of quick things I'll point out is normally when I talk to this slide, I talk about the impact of canned spam on sort of the Canadian Canadian anti-spam legislation, and what that sort of portends for marketers that have implemented or having to deal with GDPR. So if you're marketing in Europe and things like that. And so fundamentally you see, that Canada is sort of, above everybody else. And my point is not that necessarily not to take away from any Canadians that might be on this call, but not that the idea that Canadian marketers are significantly better than anybody else, but fundamentally the Castle legislation forced Canadian marketers and those that market into Canada to reconfirm permission, right, to get that express consent from their subscribers. And what that did fundamentally is it cleaned up a lot of people's databases. So they got rid of kind of the deadwood and stuff, which ultimately makes the math change, right? And so what you see is basically that because of that sort of data cleanse, if you will, the Canadian data got a lot better. And so if you're marketing into Europe and impacted by GDPR, I think you're going to see the same thing. So the point of all of that is that if whether you've been impacted by Castle or GDPR and been doing some data cleanse, you're going to have to do sort of some level setting, because again, it's fundamentally not that you've been necessarily marketing better, but it's that you've gotten rid of sort of those inactives and stuff like that. And so you have to, figure out a way to compare sort of apples to apples. And so with that, go ahead and move on to the next one, Dave. And so this is probably one of the slides that most people, when they get the report, are sort of most interested in, if you will, is again comparing themselves, your company to the individual industries. And I'm not going to go sort of through all of this, but just point out a couple of quick things. One is that you can see that the range is pretty significant. So everything from automotive and transportation, which includes auto companies, as well as companies like a UPS and people like that, and sort of in the transportation business, that they're significantly higher than a lot of the other industries, at about 45% average. And then you go down to sort of the bottom, and you're looking at sort of consumer services 15%, corporate service 18%, and leisure and sports 20%. And part of that is media and publishing is sort of nothing new to most of you, is that let's focus on media and publishing. It's just that they send a high volume, a high cadence of email, much more so than sort of like the auto industry or banks or B2B companies and stuff. And so simply that sort of cadence, that frequency is one of sort of the driving factors in sort of a lower open rate. So go ahead and click on the next one. Want to make sure we keep this on track, Dave. So the next one is really a fascinating one. One of my favorite areas of kind of numbers from the report over the years is what we've done here is basically look at just those sort of transactional messages, right? And so that's not just those messages that you think about from a retailer, confirming your purchase, right? Your order's been shipped. I mean, a lot of it is that, but it's also sort of any type of transactional message. It could be a password reset, things like that. Comparing those transactional open rates to non-transactional. So all of those, sort of promotional messages, newsletters, everything like that that's not a transaction. And you can see that the transactional messages have a significantly higher, almost sort of like a doubling open rate over those non-transactional. And it's sort of really simple why that is fundamentally those transactional messages are things that you have either asked for, or it's driven by your behavior, right? You've reset your password, you've made a purchase, you're getting notified your order's been shipped, those kinds of things. And so people want to know that, right? So they're actually sitting there in essence kind of almost waiting for that message, because they need it to kind of again, either like reset a password or have confidence that their order has been shipped. So, the message out of that Dave may sort of touch on is really to think about taking advantage of those high open rates in those transactional messages, so as appropriate, add cross-sell, upsell messages, but also think about how you can leverage the learning from that and use sort of more behavior and things like that in your to drive your non-transactional messages. So go ahead and click to the next one, Dave.
Great. So that was fantastic, and those are all real important stats, and I found them really interesting, especially about the transactional, because I've seen that so many times. Asking for that engagement, and this is what we want you to do, typically does improve open rates. So what I'm going to take a second for now is talking about some things that we can do to impact our open rates. So the average is the bottom, so how do we get above that average? So there's a few things that we can control directly. Some are more of the technical aspects, and then others are more tactical, where you can address them pretty much today if you wanted to. So the first thing I always ask people to look at when they're having low open rates is the reputation of their IP address. Okay. Now, your IP reputation is basically how email service providers see you as a responsible email sender. So things that can negatively impact your IP reputation are things like having a lot of hard bounces. So there's really two types of bounces, and I always like to level set when I start talking about bounces. There's really two types of bounces: hard bounces and soft bounces. Now, a hard bounce, for the most part, okay, most of the time, is typically it's a bad email address. Something that was a hard bounce yesterday is going to be a hard bounce today, is going to be a hard bounce 3 days from now. It's no longer a valid email address. Or another occasion, and this is a lower percentage of the time, that's when the receiving ESP has basically just blocked your IP, and under no circumstances will it ever take email from you. So if you have hard bounces, it is extremely important to remove those from your database, and because they're always going to be hard bounces, and that greatly impacts IP reputation. Is your IP, is your hard bounce rate. Now, a lot of you folks, if you're on a dedicated IP, you have direct control of that. And a further way to improve your deliverability rates when you have a dedicated IP that only you are on is through additional authentications like DKIM, SPF, SDIF. And what these authentications are at different levels is basically things you can do, setting up CNAME files, authenticating your domain that shows the ESPs, hey, this sending email is legit and basically has been given the okay to send these emails on behalf of this company. And that really does help deliverability rates. Now, the flip side of that is if you're not on a dedicated IP and you're on a shared IP, so a lot of times if you're using any off-the-shelf email deployment solution, I'm not going to name them, but typically you're, sharing those IPs with multiple companies. And that's typically why those companies, especially when you first start using them, are so strict about your hard bounce rates and your delivery rates. Because since you're sharing those IPs, that, those pipes, let's call them, if you're being a bad actor and not managing your emails and sending out a bunch of hard bounces, you're going to impact the rest of their customers. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're managing your email database properly and dropping those hard bounces. An indicator that you're probably having IP issues is if you have a high rate of soft bounces. Okay. Now, a soft bounce is different than a hard bounce. A soft bounce is basically the email is an accurate email. That email works, but the receiving domains are pushing you away. Now, sometimes that could be something innocuous that isn't bad, that their server was down, or they have some type of security setting that for some reason is hurting you that day. Okay. But typically, if you have an extremely high soft bounce rate where it's, you're sending emails and a large amount of your emails are coming back as soft bounces, that shows that, hey, this is a good email, but we don't want you in the inbox. Try again. So if you have a high rate of soft bounces, you may be having IP issues. Another thing that can really help improve your open rates is the size of your email campaign, believe it or not. Now, this was a study that I was involved with when I was at Dun & Bradstreet with one of the sister companies, Market Data Retrieval. And they sent out roughly about 20 million emails a month for the education space. And we found a direct correlation that the smaller the average campaign size, the improved deliverability rate that happened. Also, we also saw improved open rates. So that's a pretty clear indicator of better inbox placement. Okay. Now, the reason that is just think about it. If you're sending, let's just take a very basic example. If you're sending 100 emails into a company that's the same exact email to 100 people in that organization on that domain, it is extremely likely it is a promotional email. You know, that's oversimplifying, but it really illustrates the point. And we found, especially when you're sending out large volumes of email, the smaller you made those campaign sizes, the improved engagement that you got. So it doesn't mean you can't send out a million email campaign, but we have seen a direct correlation. If you break those out over a few days, you will see better open rates because you're getting better delivery rates, you're getting better inbox placement, and that translates to better open rates. Another element that's really important that so many companies really overlook and don't spend the time with it that they should is subject lines. And I can't stress this enough, and I really want to take a couple minutes on subject lines because they really are so important. And just a question to the audience is, if you think about it, how many times in your career, if you're involved with email, have you spent all this time on copy, all this time on design, and then 5 minutes before the email is supposed to go out, you try to come up with a subject line, okay? The subject line is the very first thing, any element that you control that's going to drive an open rate once it gets into that inbox. Because this is just a quick screenshot of anybody's inbox, and it's all a bunch of subject lines fighting for your attention, okay? So a lot of times when somebody's getting very low open rates, but they're not having a soft bounce issue, so, you know, the very first thing I look at is the subject line, okay? And the great thing about subject lines is that it's not something you have to spend a lot of money on. It's not something you got to go through a huge chain of command to get approved upon. It's something that you can test quickly and easily. I'm sorry, Lauren, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Awesome, no problem. You know, so subject lines, a lot of times when you have a low open rate, that's the place to start, okay? And I've seen so many campaigns of companies that are spending a lot of money, a lot of effort. If we just worked on the subject lines a little bit better, have absolutely improved. If you go from a 5% to a 10% open rate and everything stays equal, you just doubled your engagement rate, you doubled your results. So let's take a couple minutes to talk about a little bit more about subject lines. So here are my two most important tips for subject lines, because you can see a lot of information, and this is what it really comes down to in my head and what I ask myself every single time I'm working with somebody with subject lines. First off, you really have to answer these two questions, you know, that every reader, when they're looking at their inbox, is asking themselves. How does clicking on this email make my life better? Why is it worth my time to open this email? So often I see these, like, people try to be interesting, they try to be intriguing, they try to be vague. The reality is that person's looking at hundreds of different subject lines at the same time. You need to make in seconds, you need to make a point to them, this is why it's worth your time to open this, you know? So I find that works time and time again. A straightforward offer, this is why you need to open this email, usually works better than something intriguing or vague or funny or cute. You know, straightforward usually works best. Another thing is targeting a specific audience and using it in the subject line. You know, I've been testing personalization in subject lines for years now. And to be 100% honest, using name, I have never seen any real great bump in inserting somebody's name in there. Where I've seen, and without exception, using something like geographic targeting, I've never seen an exception where it doesn't improve open rates. So if you're focusing on people in New York, or in this example, focusing on people in Mississippi, use it in the subject line. Just remember it needs to be natural. You know, if you're just cramming in Mississippi and it doesn't really make sense, it's not going to work. That's still a bad subject line. But if it makes sense and it's natural, geographic targeting in a subject line absolutely improves open rates. So does job title targeting, okay, or the demographic you're targeting. Once again, you know, I primarily work in the business to business space, but I've also seen this work in the business to consumer space. If if you target those folks and use that in the subject line, so if you're marketing in this example to sales professionals, say sales professionals or VP of marketings or doctors or whatever, or moms or dads or students, use that in the subject line. You will see a positive bounce in your open rates. And then, you know, think about the subjects that you're using. If your subject matter, like we were talking about before, transactional versus more informational, but if you're talking about a certain subject, use that in the subject line. You will see improved open rates.
Hey, David, just wanted to add sort of one point that sometimes not everybody agrees with me on, but it's, you know, you can spend, the people on the call can spend a lot of time, you know, trying to improve their open rates by, excuse me, you know, working on testing and trying different types of subject lines and stuff. But ultimately, you know, you have to think about what is the goal of that email, right? Is it, in the case of B2B, is it to drive people to, you know, register for a webinar? Is it to move people down sort of the, you know, the pipeline to get a demo of a product, or in a consumer B2C approach, is it to, you know, buy a pair of shoes or whatever it is? And that, you know, fundamentally, when you're thinking about how you measure the success of your subject lines, don't just measure open rates, but also measure, you know, click-through, conversion rates, revenue, et cetera. I've tested this with clients over the years that there can oftentimes be, you know, the email with actually a lower open rate actually delivers more conversions, more revenue, et cetera. So, you know, don't stop at just sort of saying, hey, we improved the open rate through better subject lines. You know, ultimately measure it by what is that sort of end goal that you've set for that email.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Lauren, because, and this is, you know, and you see this really, if you really look at the emails that are coming into anybody's inbox, you see this all the time. It's some over the top subject line that gets you to open, and those offerings don't align. So it's great to get it's great to get a 30% open rate, but if only 5 people click when they opened it, it really isn't helping anything at the end of the day.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, you've seen, and it really started a few years ago, where you started to see marketers throwing everything but the kitchen sink into the subject line. You know, free this, deadline that, exclamation points, emoticons. You know, like, you know, and then the B2B companies did the you know, the mistake stuff. Oh, sorry, we made a mistake, when they actually didn't. You know, sort of tricking and stuff like that. But yeah, so, you know, again, improved open rates is great, but ultimately measure success based on, you know, what your actual goal is.
Definitely, great points. So another thing that you can quickly implement right away is looking at your time of day. And I'm actually going to show you a test that I recently ran around time of day. Was working with a company. They had a weekly newsletter, actually very large subscription base, okay? Had about a subscription base of about 400,000 subscribers to this newsletter. And they convinced themselves, you know, that 6 a.m. was the best time to send that out. And I just asked a quick question: when was the last time you tested that? And, this was just their conventional wisdom. And they probably tested it like 8 years ago. So I said, you know what? Why don't we test the time of day? So ultimately, what I did was across 3 campaigns, over 500,000 each. Look what I was able to do just by testing the time of day. Okay, we were able to turn that average open rate from a 14% open rate to a 22% open rate. So anybody who's listening to this webinar, ask yourself, if you do a newsletter or you always send out your promotional emails or whatever emails at a certain time, when was the last time you tested that? Because it's a very easy thing to do to test time of day, and you would be surprised that something that was true 4 or 5, maybe 2 years, maybe 1 year ago has changed. Because also, too, what's changing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this further in the presentation, is how people engage with emails. People are kind of always on email now, whether they're on their mobile device or whether they're on their laptop or whether they're on their tablet. So testing time of day can very quickly improve open rates as well. And then another thing I like to take some time to talk about is image to text ratio. Okay, and this is another test that I recently did. So here was another company. These were 3 versions of their email. Now, basically, what they were working with in their database is that they could identify that about 21% of all the people on their email list were using Gmail. Okay. Now, Gmail is notorious for hating large images. Okay. They've admitted it. Everybody knows it. They assume if there's a lot of images embedded in the email, it's a promotional email, and they're going to treat it as such. And the main reason that's not how one-on-one people communicate with each other. When was the last time you were talking to a friend or a business colleague and embedded a huge image in your email? So anytime they see large images, they treat it as promotional. So across the board, about 1 out of every 5 people that were on their database were on Gmail. Now, with the example on the left, about 6% of all the opens that were occurring on Gmail. So even though it was 21% of the list, people on Gmail were only counting about 6% of the opens. Now, when I went to a pretty much 95% text, that number spiked quite a bit. So 21% of the recipients were on Gmail, but now they accounted for about 17% of the opens. And then when I had about a 60-40 split or so, it stayed about 16%. So not really changing the articles and what was being shared, but just changing that image to text ratio. And just by doing that, the overall open rate, so taking all the lists, as you can see, jumped dramatically. Okay. And here's an interesting fact, which I don't share in this slide. And going back to Lauren's point, the middle one that was 100% text, yes, we really improved open rates quite a bit going 100% text, but that had an astronomically lower click-through rate than the example all the way on the left that had only 6% of all the opens. And the example all the way on the right had the same click-through rate as the one all the way on the left. So going to Lauren's point, just because you're getting more opens doesn't necessarily mean more clicks. And that's really the next step you want to take that to, is really thinking about, well, what's my clicks? What's my engagement? And that actually leads into my next slide, handing it back to Lauren, talking about click to open rates.
Yeah, great, Dave. Thanks. And so I've found over the years that not everybody uses or is that familiar with the click to open rate. So the sort of the standard click metric, click through rate, as everybody knows, measures basically the the percent of unique clicks, so it doesn't count multiple clicks, but so if you click it, if somebody clicks 10 times, it's only counted as 1. That's sort of the unique part, and it's that percentage of the emails basically delivered, if you will, to the end recipient. And so I think that's helpful at some level. It's helpful for sort of benchmarking, but to me, ultimately, the click-through rate is not that helpful. And so why I like the click-to-open rate is because, as Dave's been talking about, sort of the open rate and ways to improve that. The click-to-open rate says let's separate that out. So what we've done to sort of improve open rates by subject line, by time of day, by optimizing emails and stuff is one thing. Now, if we look at, of those people that have taken that first step, that opened it, what percentage of those people have actually clicked, right? And to me, so this becomes, the click-to-open rate becomes more of a diagnostic metric, because it's sort of, if you will, removing the open rate part of it, and it's just saying, let's understand what the design, the image, the layout, the calls to action, the copy, colors, how many links you have in there, and easy to find and stuff like that. So I love click-to-open rate and recommend it much more than just sort of using the click-through rate, because of that sort of diagnostic aspect to it. That being said, now let's sort of dive in, and so you can see again, sort of across the regions, there are pretty significant differences. The interesting thing about, excuse me, the click-to-open rate is the math part of it. So sometimes what you'll see is that regions, in this case, or industries, or individual companies can have actually high click-to-open rate, even though they had a sort of a lower open rate, and that's because of that math, right? Because there were fewer opens, if you will, and if they had sort of an average number of clicks, that sort of click-to-open rate can, in essence, sort of be artificially high. So it's really important to kind of understand, and level set with that. But again, as you can see here, let's go to the U.S., which is all down there in the far right, that you see sort of an average of about 11% click-to-open rate, 8.5% on the median, but that top quartile is about a quarter, meaning that of sort of the top quartile companies, right, that they're seeing about 1/4 of their recipients click on the message after they've opened it, and that's sort of a pretty decent rate. If you look across the overall, it's at, on the far left, it's about 31% and stuff. So that's typically, sort of kind of a ballpark of where you would want to be, in that 25 to 30% range. That said, one of the things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the click-to-open rate is to benchmark against your different types of messages. So, Dave showed an example of that sort of optimized Gmail message that had very few sort of images in it, and it was mostly text. You may be sending out messages that actually aren't designed, that are more sort of from a branding perspective, aren't necessarily designed to drive lots of action and clicks and stuff. So it's really important, if you're going to use the click-to-open rate, to make sure you look at different messages and compare them by the goal of that message. So go ahead and click to the next one, Dave. And again, so this is click-to-open rate, which brings to life one of the points I made. So if you look kind of up there at the top, automotive and transportation, if you remember, that had a 45% open rate. So it was the top performer of all industries from open rate perspective, but it's kind of middling, right, at sort of 13%. And my theory on that is that a lot of automotive messages are sort of that sort of branding type of thing, right? So they're not necessarily driving, no pun intended, but intended to sort of drive you to sort of take some action necessarily and stuff. So again, you can see it's sort of it's all across the board there, and so just think about using the click-to-open rate, and when you compare, also one of sort of the overarching things I would say is compare to not just your industry, but compare against other industries that use email similar to how you use it as well. Go ahead and click, Dave. And then again, we talked about sort of the difference between transactional and non-transactional messages for open rates. Again, you can see a pretty significant difference for click to open rates in sort of the transactional. Not quite double like it was for open rates, but again, pretty significant difference, about almost 43%. For the top quartile versus about 29% for non-transactional. Again, you think about transactional messages, that if it's your order has been shipped, your order is confirmed, and things like that, you're thinking, well, is there a point of do I want people to click? And so that's sort of the point of this, is that best practice companies actually find ways to use those transactional messages to drive additional purchases, right? Cross-sell, upsell, getting people to opt into other types of communications, educational stuff. So again, think about using those transactional messages to drive, since you've got so much of their attention, use it to drive an additional action that can benefit both you and them. Go ahead and click. And then now we're going to switch over to a completely different type of metric that may be new to some of you. Hopefully most of you are familiar with the concept of engagement and read rates. And so what this looks like is basically, many of you are probably familiar with the tool Litmus or Email on Asset. There's sort of a couple of tools out there that sort of measure this. We've actually embedded sort of a tool called Email Insights that's based on the Litmus platform into our platform. And so what it looks at in this case is it looks at, in essence, how long are people that are opening the message, how long are they keeping it open for, right? And so at that highest level, it's what's called read, 8 seconds or more, skimmed is 2 to 7 seconds, and glanced is under 2 seconds. And that can literally be if somebody's on a high-speed, internet connection, they're kind of scrolling through that inbox. If that image happens to load as they're sort of scrolling through, it'll basically be counted as a glance. But obviously in most cases, not always, but in most cases, you want people to engage with your message longer, right? And so understanding that how long they're spending with their email it can be a very important message or important metric around engagement, right? If people again are spending more time in the message, that should be a good thing. And so you can see here that Canada is at the high end, where their readers are spending almost 72%. 72% of them are in that read rate category, where us Americans tend to have less patience. We want things now, we sort of move on quickly and stuff, and we're at about 60%. The most important thing to think about this, though, is not what sort of regions, industry think, is to use this to understand your own readership, right? Based on what you're trying to achieve, what sort of the composition of your readership is, and understand how they're sort of interacting with. Are you falling short, or do you have too many people that are just sort of opening and then moving on and stuff? And so how can you think about designing your message to increase the percentage of your recipients that are actually spending more time with it? And the final point that I'd make is look, we have a client that actually does targeting to their customers based on which of these categories they fall into. In other words, they're segmenting their customers of those that typically open their message for more than 8%. They're actually targeting them with different kinds of different design messages and stuff. And so that's kind of the point of this, is to understand who your readers are. And if you have readers that have very little patience and stuff, you might need to redesign, think about redesigning your messages.
Great.
Go ahead and click. And then I think this is the final one of mine before I hand it off to Dave. And this is looking at the type of email client, if you will, that people are interacting with your message on. So everything from webmail to mobile to desktop. So desktop being those software applications that people would download, like a Lotus Notes or an old Outlook email client. Mobile is when you're looking at mobile on sort of a mobile email application, an app. So if somebody accesses it via the web on a mobile device, that's going to be counted as webmail. And webmail being typically like accessing your email via Gmail or something like that. And again, you can see here that it varies dramatically around the world. So this is, again, important to understand specifically to your own client base. What are they using? You know, if you're in Canada and you have a lot of people using email clients and Lotus Notes or things like that, then obviously if you target a lot of businesses, you need to understand and recognize that there may be a lot of things that will not render correctly in those clients, or if they're heavy mobile users like the people in the United Kingdom at like 63%, double some of the other regions, then you probably need to design your messages to be smaller file size so they're open more quickly. Those images will load faster and stuff. So again, hopefully all of you have optimized your messages for mobile, but this sort of email client usage really helps you understand the composition of your database and how to target them and think about designing your messages for them specifically.
Absolutely.
All right, go ahead and click, Dave.
And just staying on this point, here's a little fun thing that I found with the study that I was involved with about a year ago, is we found really what the numbers right here that Lauren's sharing with us is that you saw that roughly about 50–60% of people are on desktop and webmail. And then about 40% of folks were using mobile devices. But the real interesting fact, when then we looked at clicks on devices, even though mobile was 40% of all the devices that were being used to view the email, it only accounted for 10% of all clicks that were occurring. Okay. Yeah. And that really goes to what Lauren's talking about. And really what I'm going to start talking about a little bit is that you really do need to take some time when you're thinking about designing click-through rates to consider all the devices and different platforms that you're on. Because especially nowadays, we look at another part of the study that I was involved in, and we saw that 1 out of every 5 people looked at the same email on 2 or more devices. Okay, so you really need to take that into consideration. And I was always surprised, and I've worked with, at this point, thousands of clients over the years, but especially the past 3 or 4 years, I'm shocked when people are showing low click-through rates and they send me the email, to my Outlook or, to my desktop, but then I take a look at it and it looks fine, and then I take a look at it on my mobile device and it's a complete disaster. Okay, so you really need to be testing and looking at different devices and how your email and how people engage in that email. And that's some of the things we're going to talk about in these final couple slides. So first off, you really need to think about the platforms that you're sending to. Let me ask, a lot of the audience here, how often do you do it, or how often have you seen that you have your logo at the very top, some large hero image, and that's the first third of your email? Well, the reality is Outlook's default setting, the premier business email provider, default setting is to block images. So if your whole first third of your email is images, guess what somebody's seeing in their preview pane? A blocked image. Okay, so it's really important to keep that in mind with Outlook. And we've already touched upon it before. Gmail really hates large images in their in emails and treats them as stuff. Now, even though I'm saying Gmail, it doesn't necessarily need to be dclement@gmail.com. There is a lot of companies that use Gmail as their email solution. So it's still dclement at LSC Digital, but Gmail's the software we're using for our email. So it's really important to keep that in mind, is that image to text ratio. And then, like we talked about a couple of times, really test test your emails on mobile devices, tablets, see what they look like across multiple devices. Is the button large enough? Can I read that text without having to zoom in? Seeing what the experience is on those devices. And then just staying along this line on the design traits that every email should have to improve click-through rates is going off what I was saying before. First off, that images do get blocked. But going back to Lauren's interesting stat, where if looking at read rates, if you think about it, in the US, ultimately 40% of people are looking at an email less than 7 seconds, 7 seconds or less. Okay, think about that for a second. So it's so important to have a strong headline with a unique value proposition right at the top of that email. Don't make people think, don't make them work at wondering why they should care about this email. So having a strong headline with unique value proposition at the top of the email is so important. Also, clickable elements should be above the fold. Once again, you only have seconds really, so don't make people dig around. How often have you received an email where you literally have to read the whole email before there's any way to click to take action? Okay, doesn't mean you can't have long text emails that are valuable as long as it's good content, but have places throughout the email where somebody, if they're good, if they're ready to go, let them take action. Don't make them work. Okay. Another thing, and I don't know when this trend happens, but we have been trained since the days of Prodigy and AOL that if something is blue and underlined, it's clickable. Okay? Don't try to change that trend. Over the past few years, I've seen a lot of designers make it orange, remove the underline, things like that. Time and time again, when those things are tested, blue and underlined always wins. If you have a text link, make it blue and underlined. That is universal across the world. We all know what that means. Don't fight the trend, embrace the trend. Also, another thing, and I still see this to this day, is use what's called bulletproof buttons. I still see that buttons are used that are images. Well, once again, if your image gets blocked, people can't see it. And it's a very simple snippet of code. I encourage anybody, go on Google and just do a search for bulletproof button. And it's very simple HTML code. And always make sure that button is at least 44 by 44 pixels. There's been a lot of studies around that. And that's really taking into account mobile devices and a person's thumb. And that seems to be the optimal, at least that size seems to be the optimal use on mobile devices for people to click. And then the last point in regards to design is always remember to design for simplicity. Okay. A lot of times people get a little over the top with their designs. And the reality is the more complicated your design is, the more chances it is for something to break. The more complicated your design is, the more chances you have to confuse the reader and not get that click through. So now it doesn't mean don't be creative. You can be very creative with one column and 4 rows. But when you do that design, really think about what your goal is, why people care, why they should click through, and making sure that your design isn't watering any of that down. Okay, so those are some of my quick tips in regards to design to improve those click-through rates. And then bringing it back over to Lauren, he'll wrap it up with talking about some marketing best practices.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I know we're up against the clock here, but it sounds like there's an echo on your end there,
okay.
Dave. But anyway, if you go ahead and click, I'll do this real quickly. Dave, can you click? There we go. So we've talked about using benchmark data and the comparisons and everything like that on this webinar, and how to use it to sort of improve your open rates, click-through rates, and stuff like that. But fundamentally, what I want you to also think about is use, whether it's our benchmark report or somebody else's, use it to drive change. Use it to get more budget and resources. In other words, use the data in it not for sort of incremental improvement, but use it really to go to management, to your boss, to coworkers, to your agency if you're working with one, or whoever, to say, look, here's where we are, here's where we should be. You know, we need more resources, we need more budget, because we're really, quite frankly, falling well short, if in fact that's the case. Or in the case of sort of transactional messages, one of the things I always say, if IT owns the transactional message system in your business, you know, and your metrics are well short of the benchmarks, use it to say, look, marketing needs to take that over. So use it in the data kind of that way. Go ahead and click, Dave. And the other thing that's sort of separate from this sort of data aspect is think about benchmarking your processes, right? So all of you on this call, I'm sure, have had a mistake where you sent out an email to the wrong list, or it had the wrong price in it, or something like that. How long does it take you, as one example of a benchmarking a process, to, you know, uncover that, correct it, and send out an apology, or determine if you need to, right? Do you need to get legal approval? If that takes you a week or something, you know, you're in trouble. You need to respond typically, you know, within 24 hours. How long does it take you to actually produce a message? If there's sort of something new that you want to respond to, something happening in the marketplace, can you get an email out in, say, you know, 48 hours, or is it going to take you 10 days with 100 different approvals? So think about, and you can benchmark this just, you know, by talking to your agency if you work with one, in online forums and things like, to understand typically how long it's taking people to sort of to get things done. Go ahead and click. And lastly, if you know, for those of you that may be in an IBM Watson campaign automation client, not only is the benchmark data available in sort of a PDF report, but it's now actually in our Watson Assistant. So you can literally, as you can see on the right, you can literally just ask a question to Watson Assistant, and it'll tee up the different types of metrics that you want. Go ahead and click.
That's really cool, actually. So
yeah, very cool.
That is very cool. So with that being said, we don't have time for questions today. Sorry, me and Lauren just like talking about this stuff so much. We ran over on time. But this
went a little long. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we covered today. And everybody who's attended this webinar, you will receive a copy of this presentation, also the recording, also a copy of the report. And our contact information is right to the right there. If you have any questions, you want to follow up on anything, you know, feel free to reach out for us. You know, I really want to take a second for Lauren to take some time out of his day to help me with this presentation. Lauren really knows his stuff. He travels the country talking about this stuff, and it was really a great honor to work with him and have an opportunity to present with him. And that's about it. And so I hope everybody found this useful, and keep an eye out for some collateral from us from this webinar.
Great. Thanks, Dave, for the opportunity, and thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye, everyone.